Okay, we'll resume service. So, as the cabinet room in the wonderful exhibition next door demonstrates, Charles I liked to commission small watercolour copies of easel paintings, especially Italian old masters, that were in his collection. But I'm going to address today the evidence for the royal couple's taste for small-scale, full-length portraits of themselves and their elder children, generally painted in oil on wooden panel or occasionally on metal. And the evidence lies in the Van der Dort and sale inventories, along with surviving paintings that have Charles's ownership marks on them, now dispersed internationally. Such small paintings were by various artists, all with Low Countries links. Indeed, all the painters in question had trained in the Netherlands. Some are original compositions, while others copy elements in large-scale portraits. A number result from collaboration between artists, a common practice in the Netherlands. Such portraits are not known from the reign of James I and Anna of Denmark, indicating that they are an innovation of the reign of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. The peripatetic Flemish-born Hendrik van Steenwyk, who had arrived in London in 1617, generally worked on a small scale, on wooden panel or on copper. He painted imaginary architectural interiors, known to contemporaries as perspectives, of Gothic buildings, often churches. Once in England, he also produced numerous versions of the scene of St. Peter in prison, in a kind of groined Gothic interior dungeon, and of St. Jerome in his study. And this is a sort of variant example, which I've taken almost at random, really, of about 1625. And Charles I owned around a dozen independent paintings by van Steenwyk, as well as, quote, a little book of perspectives. Van Steenwyk was also tasked with painting grand, fictive, classicist architectural settings for full-scale portraits on canvas carried out by portrait specialists. And he based these settings on Northern European prints, which used one-point and multi-point perspective, especially examples in the Book of Perspectives by the Netherlandish architect, painter and engineer Hans Fredemand de Vries, the book published in The Hague in 1604-05. And we can see really an example here. Sometimes Van Steenwyk's input into large-scale painted portraits is presumed, because who else is going to have painted these settings? And sometimes it's documented, as here in the Turin full length of Charles I, probably painted for the king's brother and sister-in-law, the Duke and Duchess of Savoy. And the king's figure is painted by the Dutch incomer to London, Daniel Meitens, a man who had worked at The Hague and had arrived in London in 1618 to become James I's principal painter, and then, after James's death, Charles's. And we know this because both artists separately signed and dated the canvas. So Van Steenwyk's is on the plinth on the right with the date 1626, and Meitens's is on the centre plinth, dated 1627. So I've isolated them. I think they're not incredibly clear even so, but there they are. Two different dates. James I's family members were never painted, as far as we know, as a group, only as separate individuals. Charles and Henrietta Maria, on the other hand, were keen to emphasise the closeness of their own new family unit. And this is most clearly manifest in the huge, great piece commissioned from the Flemish Anthony van Dyck very soon after his arrival in London in spring 1632. Obviously, it's next door in the Royal Academy, depicting the King and Queen and their two eldest children as a stately but interconnected group. So the little boy is the future Charles II, born in 1630, and the babe in arms is Princess Mary, born in November 1631. And this innovatory painting was to have a considerable impact on other artists and clients. But the family theme was also explored in this small work made by the Dutch portrait and genre specialist Hendrik Pot, who visited London from Haarlem in 1632. The king and queen, and in this case just the son, just Charles, so he's that bit younger, that bit much of a baby, are shown. It doesn't appear in either the Van der Dort or the sale inventories, and was first recorded in a Hague collection in the 18th century. That may indicate that it went out to the Royal Dutch ruling house as a gift. Closely related to it is, on the right, a single small full length of the king, and this is signed H.P. Hendrik Pot, 1632, and it's now in the Louvre. The king's hair is very slightly differently dressed in it. Its known provenance goes back to, in this case, definitely to the House of Orange, again only in the 18th century, certainly suggesting it may have been a gift from Charles to the stadtholder Frederick Henry. Cornelius Johnson's parents were Flemish-German migrants to London, and Johnson seems to have been partly trained in the northern Netherlands, though he was back in London at the end of 1618. During the 1620s, he had numerous clients from the upper levels of British society. He also made tiny portrait miniatures, painted in oil on copper. This is unusual. English miniaturists usually used watercolour on vellum. And like his easel portraits, Johnson's miniatures show his refined technique and detailed rendition of dress, particularly lace, as seen in this miniature of an unknown woman who looks a bit like Henrietta Maria, but has blue eyes, unlike Henrietta Maria. Shortly after Van Dyck had produced the great piece, Charles clearly commissioned at least two near-identical small portraits on copper from Johnson, and I'm showing one of them, massive scale, on the right. He's employing his miniaturist technique. They're clearly copies of Prince Charles's figure from the great piece, and both are about 25 by 21 centimetres. In December 1632, Charles appointed Johnson, quote, his picture drawer, and seems to have used him mainly to make small-scale royal portraits such as these, presumably to present to supporters. And one of these two images of Prince Charles has a label on the reverse indicating that it was a personal gift from Charles to his master of horse, the Marquis of Hamilton. According to the writer Cornelis de Bie, the Antwerp painter and printmaker Adrian van Stalbemt was invited to London by Charles I in 1632, that same year, where he spent less than a year. He was accustomed to collaborating, and indeed the little figures in this small view of Greenwich, signed by Stalbemt, were inserted by another painter, Jan van Belkamp, who also signed. We have these two signatures in initials. Now, Jan van Belkamp receives a number of payments from Henrietta Maria. This painting is listed in both the Van der Dort and the sale inventories. Van Belkamp, reputedly born in Antwerp, attended the Dutch church in London alongside Cornelius Johnson, and he's mainly now known as a copyist. According to his contemporary, Richard Simons, he assisted Van der Dort in curating the Royal Collection, and Simons added that when people wanted copies of works in the Royal Collection, Van der Dort would refer them to Van Belkamp, and in 1649, Van Belkamp would be appointed to the commission set up to sell the late King's goods. So here again, Prince Charles is copied from Van Dyck's great piece, while the figure of Henrietta Maria is based upon Van Dyck's 1632 double portrait of her with the king. And this image of the Queen was clearly considered a great success, Van Dyck himself would reuse it with slight variations for other portraits, such as this, which we saw briefly earlier. Quote, one of our royal consort, which hung in the king's bedchamber at Whitehall. So it was the image that Charles most liked of Henrietta Maria. Collaboration is also evident in these two small visually paired portraits, now in Dresden, painted on panel and measuring 50 by 46.5 and 51 by 44.5 centimetres respectively. According to Van der Dort, who noted them in the chair room at Whitehall, the prospective piece was done by Stanwyck and the King's picture therein done by Cornelius Johnson. While in another manuscript, and that's noted at the bottom here on the page, he noted that the one of the Queen was, quote, done by John van Belkam. And indeed, Charles's portrait is signed by Van Steenwyck and dated 1637. So that's the signature area to the left. Its prototype may be the Turin Portrait by Daniel Meitens, which we saw earlier, although the apparel has been slightly updated. Now, the small portrait of the Queen copies a Van Dyck composition, seen here on the left, known in various studio versions, two of which are dated 1636. The one here is in the Royal Collection, and you can see how really very much a faithful reduced size copy it is. And again, Van Steenwyck's fictive classical settings are based on designs by Fredemund de Vries. And the two pictures would be sold to the King's brewer Robert Houghton in 1651. They were later acquired in Paris in 1755 for Dresden, then as being by Van Steenwyck and Gonzales Cox. So the names had been lost. Not all the small-scale full-lengths were copies or combinations of borrowed elements. Some were original compositions, clearly based on first-hand sittings. Two of these three finely detailed small portraits of the royal couple's eldest children on oak panel are signed in monogram by Cornelius Johnson and dated 1639. Each is about 29 by 20 centimetres. All three paintings are currently on view in the Queen's House at Greenwich. Johnson employed his miniaturist technique again here. Each child has a carefully chosen open-air scene behind them. Thus, behind Charles, Prince of Wales, there's a military exercise in progress. Behind little James, Duke of York, who holds a pistol, a hunt is visible, while behind Princess Mary, there's a garden with a fountain. Here just is a detail of Charles. You can see this does appear to be an original sitting. And in the sale inventory, they appear as three pictures of the late P, Prince presumably, Princess, and Duke of York by Johnson. And they too were acquired in the sale by Robert Houghton, although by around 1666 they were back in Charles II's collection, and I'm grateful to Nico Muntz for that information. In all these cases, the practitioners had been trained in the Netherlands, and most had arrived here in the year 1632. Meanwhile, more complex, smaller-scale royal images were being produced around the Dutch court, where Charles's sister Elizabeth and her husband Frederick of Bohemia, the so-called Winter King and Queen, lived in exile. Born in Antwerp, by 1622, Bartholomeus van Bassen had settled at The Hague. He was not only a painter, but also a practicing architect, working there for Elizabeth and Frederick. And here, shown dining formally, they are the subject of this signed work by Van Bassen. A second version of it, once in the Fielding collection, is known to be dated 1634. So by 1634, Elizabeth was a widow and may have commissioned this and the other picture to send to England to send to her brother and sister-in-law, and other potential supporters, although the known provenance of this work only goes back to its acquisition by Queen Caroline in 1729. Van Bassen collaborated frequently with figure painters such as the Utrecht Cornelis van Pullenberg, a process that could not only involve practitioners in different studios, but even in different cities. The so-called Arundel Cabinet, formerly at Tart Hall, has been in the Portland collection since 1725. We see here on the left the whole cabinet and then a detail of the central painting. Its interior contains 25 drawers, each painted with small landscapes with figures on Ovidian themes, and one of them bears the monogram CPF for Cornelis Pullenberg Fekit. In addition, its 2 doors are painted on the inside with imaginary palatial interiors with colonnades. The right-hand one is signed and dated by Van Bassen, 1636, and that's the year in which it's thought the cabinet was given by Elizabeth of Bohemia to Lady Arundel. And of course, Van Pullenberg himself subsequently came to London at least once. Charles I paid for his accommodation here from March 1637 to March 1638, and he may have come again afterwards. And the royal couple's collection contained a number of his small Arcadian landscape pieces. This variant of Van Bassen's picture depicts not Elizabeth and Frederick, but Charles I, Henrietta Maria, and Prince Charles. He's here at the end of the table. And it's signed by Van Bassen's former pupil, Gerrit Haukgeest. I know there's a debate about the pronunciation. I'm going to say Haukgeest. And dated 1635. So they too appear in an imagined grand interior, dining before an audience, which is actually something that Charles was in reality extremely unwilling to do. And here's a detail of the royal group. This picture was first recorded in the collection of Charles II, but it seems that likely that it too may have been commissioned by Elizabeth, although it's not clear where it was painted. Haukgeest had trained at The Hague with Van Bassen and became a member of the Painters Guild there in 1625. By 1635, he'd settled in Delft, where documents regularly place him until 1649. So far, firm evidence that Haukgeest came to England has been lacking. And thus, it's thought that he painted this, or perhaps just the lavish fictive setting, in his workshop in Delft, conveniently near the court at The Hague, and that the royal figures may have been added by another painter. It has been suggested, because the details of dress are considered to be so English in fashion, that they might have been painted by an artist based in London, and Van Belkamp has been suggested. A possible scenario is that Elizabeth initiated the project, and if she did indeed introduce the royal couple to Haukgeest's work, it was evidently a success, because the sale inventories would show that they owned 4 works by him, all described as perspectives. One of them must have been this one, which is now back in the royal collection, with a CR brand mark on the back. And the inventory takers had real problems with his Dutch name, spelling it in 4 really different, really strange ways. So finally, I'd like to consider this small full length from the royal couple's collection. You see, top left, I've put in from the back, Charles I's mark on the back. It's now in a private US collection and on loan at the Yale Centre for British Art, and I'm very grateful to Jessica David for her technical notes on it. It was listed in the Windsor manuscript of Van der Dort's inventory of circa 1639 as a perspective piece painted by Haukgeest, and the Queen's picture therein at length, done by Cornelius Johnson, whereof the clothes are not as yet finished. And the Ashmolean manuscript of the inventory added, "The Queen's face is finished by that is in Somerset House, above the chimney, of Sir Anthony van Dyck. The dimensions given by van der Dort are close to its present-day ones. The fictive architecture, again, resembles those of Frederman de Vries, and particularly these two plates. I'm grateful to Sally Jeffrey for suggesting these. And van der Dort's additional comment tells us that, again, Van Dyck's 1632 double portrait, painted to hang over the chimney piece at Somerset House, was the model for the face. And you can see this, even though the scale is so different. Now, the Queen's dress in this painting is somewhat unorthodox, and the blue cloak, for instance, obscures the shape of her sleeve and the level of her waistline, which give us indications about dating. The open gown and petticoat were a form of fancy dress. And recent technical examination shows that the architectural setting was finished first, with a reserve left for the area of the Queen's head and shoulders, although possibly not for the rest of the figure. And so, for instance, the blue cloak goes over the column behind, so it's painted over finished architecture. The architectural setting is the type that Van Steenwyck would previously have been asked to paint, although if this were commissioned after he left England in 1638, he would of course no longer have been available. So Hougeest may have painted the fictive architecture, again in his studio in Delft, leaving a partial reserve for a figure, a procedure that as a perspective painter he was well accustomed to. The painting was then sent unfinished to London, where Johnson, a picture drawer on the royal payroll, was tasked with painting in the Queen, in the reserve area. And this he did, but perhaps only the head and upper body, leaving the rest of the figure unfinished, which is the word that van der Dort used in 1639. So maybe the remaining area was completed later, perhaps not by Johnson, who emigrated for good to the United Provinces in October 1643. This painting was not in the sale inventories, and nor does it seem to have returned to the royal collection after the restoration. So, to conclude, the taste for including royal portraits in fictive grand architectural settings here in Britain seems to have begun with Charles and Henrietta Maria. It was a Netherlandish taste, and perhaps was partly developed, encouraged further by Elizabeth of Bohemia, sending works to London from The Hague. The key year in this narrative was 1632, the year in which Charles extended a welcome to painters from the northern and southern Netherlands. Pot's brief visit that year may have kick-started the interest. Some examples by Pot and by Johnson were original works based on fresh sittings, while most were small-scale copies of, or mishmashes combining, carefully chosen and approved prototypes, generally from royal portraits by the principal painter, Van Dyck. Thank you.